COVID-19, coronavirus, or as I call it, the Chinese or the Wuhan virus, is at the center stage of discussion and the government's attentions all over the globe. In fact, it has brought to the fore, for the first time in living memory, the importance of combating non-traditional security threats that nations may face. All this while, the nations were prepared for what is called traditional threats. In Simply Nitin this week, I want to tell our viewers about how the militaries have always been prepared for kinetic wars, for combat with weapons and platforms and missiles and guns and bullets. But they're only waking up to the real threat of non-traditional means that are going to threaten national security and across the globe, not just one nation or two nations. I am Nitin Gokhale. The unprecedented lockdown of over 3 billion people across the globe, 1.3 billion of them in India, has actually brought to the center stage the threat of non-traditional security matters. What are non-traditional security matters? Now, in the traditional security matters, nation states prepared to take on other nation states most of the time, or sometimes non-state actors, like it happens in Afghanistan, or it happened in Somalia, or sometimes it happened in India's northeast or Jammu and Kashmir. The battle between states and non-state actors, or the wars between different nations, India-Pakistan wars, India-China war of 1962, the American-Vietnam war in the late 60s, early 70s, the Gulf War won in 1990s. All these were, of course, the biggest of them all were World War I and World War II, the two big wars of the 20th century. They were kinetic wars. They were defined boundaries and people were trying to alter boundaries. But when it comes to non-traditional security threats, the boundaries are non-existent, actually. Look at the way the coronavirus or the Chinese virus has spread across the globe. It hasn't spared one single nation on this earth from its scourge. And therefore, the militaries have to really get prepared to combat these threats. 6 months ago, coincidentally, I was speaking as a keynote speaker at the Colombo Defense Seminar 2019 in Sri Lanka. And in that keynote address, I had mentioned that militaries of the future will have to prepare to combat non-traditional security threats like pandemics, epidemics, apart from the floods and earthquakes and tsunamis, which are natural disasters. Of course, information security is another non-traditional security threat which nations have to combat, and the militaries have to be at the forefront of that. There are a number of non-traditional security threats to be taken care of. Health for one, water shortage for another. Developing countries are likely to experience a surge in both infectious and non-infectious diseases, and in general will have inadequate health care capacities and spending. But now if you look at the Chinese virus, what has it done? It has locked down people in countries like India and other smaller nations. It has disrupted economies, it has disrupted supply chains, it has meant complete overhaul or complete rethink on how nations have to think of their security. Now, the militaries the world over will have to actually do a paradigm shift in the allocation of resources that they may have with them, because after all, resources are limited. And if they have to combat non-traditional security threats like epidemics and pandemics and natural disasters, which in any case many militaries the world over, especially in the Indian subcontinent, have done for a number of years, what is called the HADR operations, that is the humanitarian assistance disaster relief. But those threats came from natural calamities, tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, and cloudburst in places like Ladakh. All those brought in misery to the people, but to a limited geographical extent. This is the first time in living memory that a non-traditional security threat has engulfed the entire globe. And how are the militaries preparing for it, or how are the militaries thinking of combating all this? If you look at the initial response to the Chinese virus, the Chinese state itself had brought in its paramilitary forces or the internal security forces to combat the virus in Wuhan or the Hubei province. In US, the National Guards, part of the security forces in the United States, is out on the streets of New York and other cities. In India, the three armed forces are at the forefront of establishing facilities and doing multiple other things for the benefit and the relief of COVID-19 or the Chinese virus patients. In Sri Lanka, the army has set up quarantine facilities. In other countries, smaller countries too, the militaries are at the forefront. The point that I'm trying to make is that the militaries will have to cater to the non-traditional security threats, which are only going to increase as time goes by. We may not have a full-fledged World War II kind of a combat or a conflict between different nation states or between different blocks of nations, but increasingly the nations like India, like China, like United States and European nations, so-called developed economies, so-called developed nations, will face the threat of pandemics, epidemics and diseases as time goes by, because we are so interconnected. So how are the militaries preparing? I'm not going to talk about what other militaries are doing, because that is all available elsewhere. Not that the information about the Indian military is not available, but the Indian military and the Indian Ministry of Defense, apart from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the other departments of the Government of India, the Indian military is right at the forefront, leading the effort to combat the Chinese virus and its after effects. What are they doing? The Indian military has set up about half a dozen quarantine facilities at various places like Manesar, Hindon, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, Mumbai. With the quarantine facilities, additional quarantine facilities for more than 950 patients of 950 beds. The Defense Research and Development Organization, or DRDO, has manufactured in its various labs 20,000 liters of sanitizers and given it to various organizations to combat the Chinese virus. DRDO has also supplied 10,000 masks to Delhi police personnel. The Ordnance Factory Board and the Bharat Electronics Limited have started manufacturing ventilators, which will be required if the number spikes up. As we speak this week, the number is around 650-700 positive patients of the Chinese virus in India. If this number goes up, India will require more and more ventilators, and the Army Medical Teams, Army Medical Corps, is right at the forefront of this effort. 2 ships of Navy are on standby to provide required assistance to friendly neighboring countries, say Sri Lanka or Maldives or even Mauritius. And of course, all other facilities, all other resources of the military are on standby in case it's required in the emergency. Clearly then, the militaries the world over, and especially in the region that India is located in, are waking up to this reality of combating non-traditional security threats. And this is something that the militaries will have to train themselves more and more, allocate more and more resources, more and more personnel for such an eventuality in the near future or even in a distant future, because that's the way the world is now going to face increasingly the threats emanating from viruses, from diseases, from pandemics and epidemics that will sweep through different nations without any boundaries being the obstacles. That's all I have this week, but I'll come back again for another edition. But Do not forget to like us on various social media handles, and of course, keep sending your feedback in our comment section. Until then, it's goodbye and good luck. Stay safe.